what would happen if the person you just ordered to be removed from the courthouse gates because you believed she didn't belong here, was it, in fact, the highest authority in that very building? And the most frightening part is not that you didn't know who she was. It's that you never considered who she could be. That morning, on the cold stone steps of a federal courthouse, a decision that lasted less than 30 seconds destroyed 18 years of a career and exposed a truth many people prefer not to face. If you have ever believed that "I was just following procedure" is enough, this story may make you reconsider. Stay until the end, because its twist does not just change one person's fate. It may change the way you see the world. Atlanta, 7:28 a.m. The city was still half asleep. Early sunlight slanted across glass towers, reflecting in thin streaks on the granite sidewalk in front of the federal courthouse. The crisp chill of early spring slowed people's steps slightly, as if the entire city had not yet fully awakened. The building stood firmly in the heart of the financial district, a symbol of law, of order, of decisions capable of altering the course of an entire lifetime. And like many other mornings, there was someone who arrived earlier than everyone else. Federal Chief Judge Evelyn Carter, 39 years old. No police escort, no entourage, no special insignia. Just a gray sedan pulling into its usual spot along the side of the building. Evelyn turned off the engine and sat still for a few seconds before opening the door. She had that habit every morning, a moment of stillness before stepping into a day filled with difficult decisions. Because her job was not simply to preside over cases, she determined sentences for those convicted of crimes. She decided who would be granted bail and who would wait behind bars. She ruled on filings that could shape the future of an entire family. Every decision carried weight. And she had always believed that to render a fair judgment, her mind had to be completely calm. That was why she arrived early. Earlier than the administrative staff, earlier than most attorneys, and even earlier than the defendants escorted into the holding cells behind the building. She opened the car door and stepped out. Low heels touched lightly against the stone. A refined but straightforward navy suit, understated, not ostentatious. A dark brown leather briefcase in her left hand. Inside were the files for the 9 a.m. criminal hearing. A federal drug case. 2 defendants, one with prior convictions, a father of 2 young children. She had read the case file the night before, but she still wanted to review it once more in the quiet of early morning. Evelyn walked toward the private entrance reserved for judges, an entrance few people knew about, tucked behind a large stone column. The keycard system there usually worked reliably, allowing her to go directly upstairs to her chambers without passing through the public area. But that morning, the small light above the card reader blinked red. Access denied. She tried again. Still red. Evelyn exhaled softly, not irritated, merely adjusting her plan in her mind. The system sometimes required updates. It was not uncommon. She glanced at her watch. 7:34 a.m. Still enough time. She turned and walked toward the main entrance, where the public, attorneys, and staff typically entered. A wider entrance, brighter, busier. And there, an unusual morning shift was already in place. Deputy Sheriff Brian Callahan, 52, is in charge of courthouse security. He had worked in judicial security for nearly 2 decades, usually on the night shift. That morning, because a colleague had called in unexpectedly, he had to cover the early shift. Morning shifts were different from nights. At night, there was maintenance, silence, footsteps echoing down empty corridors. During the day, there was a stream of people. Attorneys in expensive suits, reporters, defendants, families of defendants. Callahan did not like the morning shift. Too many faces, too much movement, too many uncontrolled variables. He stood near the door, hand close to his radio, eyes scanning each person as they climbed the steps. And then he saw Evelyn, a black woman, nearly 40, walking confidently, without hesitation. No badge pinned to her chest, no staff escort, no pause to ask for directions. She walked straight toward the main doors as if the place belonged to her. Callahan frowned slightly. He did not recall seeing her on the personnel list that morning. He did not recognize her face. And more importantly, in his mind, the image of a federal chief judge looked different. Older, usually male, usually white. Those small prejudices did not form into spoken words, but they existed quietly, like an invisible filter. Evelyn stepped onto the top stair. Callahan moved across her path, subtly blocking her way. "Ma'am, public. Screening is that way." His voice was not rude, but it was not a greeting either. Evelyn stopped, her gaze steady. "I'm aware." Just 2 words. No raised voice, no argument. Callahan tilted his head. "This entrance is restricted." Evelyn replied, still composed. "I know." A quiet moment hung between them. No shouting, no visible tension, just 2 worlds colliding. Callahan observed the way she stood, the way she looked him straight in the eye, the way she did not appear uncomfortable. In his experience, those who belonged here usually exchanged greetings and offered a few friendly words. She did not. She simply walked in as though she had the right, and that unsettled him. "Not today," he said, his tone hardening. Evelyn glanced at her watch again. 7:38 a.m. She could have said right then, "I am Chief Judge Carter." She could have taken out her phone and called her clerk. She could have requested to see the security supervisor. But she did not. Because an obvious thought crossed her mind. "Why should I have to prove that I deserve to walk through this door?" She simply said, "You're making a mistake." A sentence as light as a breeze, but something in the way she said it made Callahan feel challenged. And that was the small moment, tiny, when the personal histories of 2 individuals diverged in different directions. Callahan reached out. He grabbed her wrist, an action that lasted less than 2 seconds, but enough to turn a quiet morning into a story that would be spoken of nationwide. The leather briefcase slipped from Evelyn's hand and fell onto the stone steps. The dry sound echoed in the still, sparsely populated space. She did not pull away, did not shout, did not resist. She simply looked straight at him, and in her eyes, there was no fear. There was disappointment. Disappointment because she knew it was not that he did not know who she was. It was that he had never considered who she could be. And in that very moment, on an ordinary morning in Atlanta, a chain of events began that would force an entire system to look into the mirror and examine itself. The moment Brian Callahan's hand touched Evelyn Carter's wrist lasted less than 2 seconds. But some touches are not merely physical contact. They are declarations. The leather briefcase fell onto the stone steps, one corner cracking open. The files inside shifted. Pages containing the fates of others slid slightly outward. Evelyn looked down, then lifted her gaze. Her eyes were not panicked, not angry, not pleading. Only one thing was clearly visible: awareness. She was aware that this was not a random misunderstanding, not a system malfunction, not a shift change confusion, but an assumption had been made, quickly, decisively, without verification. Callahan tightened his grip on her wrist slightly, as if afraid she might continue forward. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." His voice lowered. It was no longer a reminder. It was a command. Evelyn inhaled deeply. 2 options flashed through her mind. The first, state her title, end everything in 10 seconds. The second, remain silent. Observe where this would lead. Most people would choose the first option, because everyone wants to escape humiliation as quickly as possible. But Evelyn understood something far more profound. If she had to rely on power to be treated with basic decency, then the problem was not that morning. It was in how power was distributed in others' minds. "Sir," she said calmly, "you don't need to do this." That sentence did not soften Callahan. On the contrary, in his experience, people who were trouble often used a composed tone to mask their intentions. He signaled to 2 nearby security officers. They stepped forward. None of the 3 men knew who they were standing before, but more importantly, none of them asked to find out. Callahan did not request identification, did not ask her name, did not check the internal system, did not call the administration. He acted based on what he believed to be professional instinct. And that instinct had been formed over many years, but never re-examined. They pulled her back from the main entrance. Passers-by began to slow. A young attorney stopped. A janitor froze just inside the glass doors. A woman scrolling through her phone looked up. No one shouted. No one intervened. But every eye watched. The briefcase still lay on the steps. Evelyn did not yank her arm away. She knew that if she resisted, everything would escalate. She had spent 12 years seated at the prosecutor's table. She understood how a report gets written. Subject became non-compliant. Subject resisted directive. Minimum force applied. She would not hand them another line of justification. So she kept her back straight, her chin lifted, and allowed them to pull her across the cold stone steps. The moment lasted about 30 seconds. 30 seconds is not enough time to brew a cup of coffee, not enough to read an email, but enough to erase 18 years of a career. When they stopped at the public screening area, Callahan released her. "You can wait here." It sounded like a concession, but in reality, it was a placement. He had assigned her position within his system. Evelyn looked at her wrist, a faint red mark forming against her skin. It didn't hurt much, but it would be remembered. She bent to retrieve her briefcase. The papers inside were slightly disordered. She straightened each page carefully. A young staff member approached quietly. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Evelyn nodded. She could have said at that moment, "I am Chief Judge Carter," and everyone around would have shifted their posture. But she did not, because if she spoke now, it would become a story about an unfortunate misunderstanding. If she remained silent for a few minutes longer, perhaps it would become a story about truth. Callahan stood a few steps away, arms crossed. He did not believe he had done anything wrong. In his mind, procedure had been followed. A woman approached a restricted entrance. Did, not present. ID, did not comply as instructed. He had maintained order. The only problem was, he had never questioned whether his definition of order was fair. A group of white attorneys stepped onto the stairs. Callahan nodded in greeting and opened the door. No ID requested, no obstruction. They passed by Evelyn as if she were invisible. That moment, small but sharp as a blade, not because of rudeness, but because of the contrast. Evelyn watched the scene. She took no notes, said nothing, but in her mind the pieces were assembling. If this were a single occurrence, it could be dismissed. But what if it was not? She checked her watch. 7:49 a.m. Her hearing began at 9 o'clock. Her clerk was likely preparing the courtroom. The defendants may already have been escorted to the holding area in the rear. They were waiting for her. Yet she was standing here, instructed to wait for screening. A small delay, but within the legal system, time is power. Callahan approached her again. "Do you have identification now?" The question came late, very late. Evelyn looked at him. "I do." She opened her briefcase, but before removing her ID, she paused. She realized the issue was not the card. The issue was the moment before the card was requested, the moment he decided she did not belong. And in that moment, she understood that this story would not end on the granite steps. It would go further. Much further. Because some mistakes are personal, but others expose an entire system. And that morning, beneath the early sunlight of Atlanta, a system had just been tested. 3 months after that morning, courtroom number 4 of the federal courthouse in Atlanta was filled. The air felt heavy, like the moments before a storm. The public gallery was packed with reporters, attorneys, law students, and even individuals who had filed complaints but had never received a response. On the plaintiff's table sat thick case files. At the defense table, Brian Callahan sat upright, uniform immaculate, badge gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. He was no longer in a position to control the entrance. Today, he was in the position of answering. His attorney, a silver-haired man with a deep voice, began the direct examination. "Deputy Callahan, how long have you served in judicial security?" 18 years. "Have you been trained to assess risk and protect courthouse safety?" "Yes, sir." Familiar questions, prepared answers. Callahan spoke about his night shift experience, about recognizing unusual behavior, about the responsibility to ensure that no unauthorized person enters restricted areas. He used phrases that sounded entirely reasonable. Standard procedure, officer discretion, maintaining order. He said he did not see race. He said he saw behavior. He said every decision was based on security. The courtroom listened in silence. On some level, what he said sounded reasonable. Society needs security. Courthouses require control. Procedures exist to protect everyone. Then came cross-examination. Civil rights attorney Rachel Donovan stood. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. Her tone was soft, but each question pierced like a needle through a shell of confidence. "Deputy Callahan, that morning, did you request that Ms. Carter present official identification?" "I asked her to cooperate." "I'm asking specifically, did you request her ID?" A beat of silence. "Not initially." "Did you check the internal system to verify the list of newly appointed judges?" "No, it's not my responsibility to update personnel records." "Did you call the administrative office to ask whether anyone was scheduled to arrive early that morning?" "No." "Did you ask her what her name was?" "No." A subtle movement rippled through the courtroom, not because the answers were shocking, but because they were clear. Rachel stepped closer. "So the only thing you relied on to block Ms. Carter was—" Callahan inhaled. "Professional judgment." "Professional judgment based on what?" She looked like she didn't belong in that area. Rachel did not react immediately. She let the words hang in the air. "Didn't belong. In what sense, Deputy?" Callahan looked down at the table. He knew any word he chose could become evidence. "She looked out of place." Out of place. Again. The phrase sounded harmless, but repeated, it began to take shape. Rachel continued. "Out of place at a federal courthouse. A woman in a business suit, carrying a briefcase. Arriving at 7:30 a.m., you found that out of place?" Callahan tried to remain steady. "I acted for safety." "Safety from what?" The question landed like a sudden stop. From what? From the woman arriving early for work? From a leather briefcase? From confidence? Or from an image that did not match the assumptions in his mind? Rachel turned to evidence. On the screen behind them, security footage appeared. March 15th, a black attorney was detained for 5 minutes. April 3rd, a Latino staff member stopped at a side entrance. May 20th, an Asian law professor must present 3 separate forms of identification. Then another clip. A white woman in jeans entered. Callahan smiled and opened the door. No ID requested, no obstruction, no professional judgment. A murmur began spreading through the courtroom. Rachel did not raise her voice. Deputy, you stated that you do not see race, yet statistics show you checked people of color at 11 times the rate of white individuals. How do you explain that? Callahan swallowed. That's a coincidence. Coincidence repeated 17 times in 6 months. Silence. She opened another document. You missed 17 training sessions on bias and civil rights over the past 5 years. Yet you attended every firearms and promotion training. Was it only the courses about bias that you lacked time for? Callahan began to lose the certainty he had shown earlier. He was no longer the one controlling the door. He was standing before his own, and it was closing. Rachel moved to her final question. Deputy Callahan, when you looked at Ms. Carter that morning, what did you think a federal chief judge looked like? The question was not designed to elicit an answer. It was designed to expose an absence. Callahan opened his mouth, then it closed it. Because in his mind, the image of a chief judge did not resemble Evelyn, and that was the core of it. It was not that he did not know who she was. It was something he had never imagined she could be that person. The courtroom fell silent. This was no longer a story about a wrist being grabbed, no longer a story about a single morning. It was a story about how procedure can become a shield for prejudice. The procedure itself is not wrong, but when the person enforcing it carries unexamined assumptions, the procedure can become a weapon. Rachel concluded her cross-examination with a quiet statement. Sometimes what we call instinct is simply bias that was never questioned. And in that moment, the entire courtroom understood that this case no longer revolved around one individual. It revolved around a system. And that system had just been placed under a microscope. Across the room, Evelyn Carter sat in silence. She showed no sign of victory, no nod, no reaction. Because she knew the most important thing had not yet been said. And when it was said, the story would change completely. The courtroom still carried the echo of the cross-examination. The words professional judgment and out of place seemed to linger in the air. But all of it, the numbers, the footage, the statistics, no matter how powerful, was only the surface. Because something more critical had not yet been said. Rachel Donovan turned toward the plaintiff's table. Your Honor, we call our next witness. Evelyn Carter rose, not hurried, not theatrical. She walked to the witness stand with calm composure, as if she were accustomed to standing there. And in truth, she was. It was just that she usually sat in a higher seat. She placed her hand on the Bible and took the oath. Her voice, as she swore to tell the truth, did not tremble. It did not rise. It did not fall. It was simply clear. Rachel began gently. Miss Carter, what time did you arrive at the courthouse that morning? 7:30 a.m.? Why did you arrive so early? To prepare for the 9 a.m. criminal hearing. Was that hearing important? Evelyn offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Every hearing is important. That answer caused several people in the courtroom to glance at one another. She did not speak about herself. She spoke about responsibility. Rachel continued. Can you describe what happened when you reached the main entrance? Evelyn recounted it, step by step. She spoke about the keycard system not working, about having to walk to the main entrance, about Callahan's first look, about the words, "Not today." She did not embellish, she did not dramatize, she did not use the word assault. She said, "He grabbed my wrist." She did not say, "He humiliated me." She said, "I was physically removed." That restraint made the story stronger. Rachel paused. "Did you resist?" "No." "Why not?" Evelyn was silent for several seconds. The pause was not to search for words, it was to choose the truth. "Because I knew that if I reacted more strongly, the story would no longer revolve around his behavior, but around mine." A few quiet exhalations moved through the courtroom. She continued, "I served as a prosecutor for 12 years. I know how a report is written." Rachel stepped closer. "Did you tell Deputy Callahan your title?" "No." "Why not?" That question was the pivot point. The entire room seemed to lean forward. Evelyn looked directly at the jury. "Because if I need a title to be treated with dignity, then the problem is not the title." The sentence was not loud, but it reached deeper than any piece of evidence. She continued, "I wanted to know, if I were simply a woman arriving early for work, how I would be treated." The courtroom fell silent. No more rustling papers, no more typing. Only awareness is spreading slowly. Rachel lowered her voice. "Could you tell the court your role within the judicial system?" Evelyn gave a slight nod. "I was appointed federal chief judge for the Northern District of Georgia 2 months before the incident." A beat. No one breathed. "I was assigned to preside over the 9 a.m. criminal hearing that morning." This time, it was not murmuring. It was the sound of sharp inhalations. Some turned to look at Callahan, others looked down at their files. A reporter dropped a pen. Rachel did not need to say more. The truth spoke for itself. Callahan had not merely pulled aside a citizen. He had removed a federal chief judge from her own workplace, not because she lacked authority, but because in his mind, that authority could not take her form. The presiding judge tapped the gavel lightly. "Order!" But the order in the room had already changed. Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering. "As a result of that action, my hearing was delayed by 43 minutes. The detained defendants waited longer. Attorneys had to adjust their schedules, and I entered the robing room with a red mark on my wrist." She did not say it for sympathy. She said it to establish a consequence. Rachel asked her final question. "Do you believe that if Deputy Callahan had known you were the chief judge, he would have acted differently?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. She looked toward Callahan, not with resentment, simply with steadiness. "Yes. And that is precisely the problem." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, not because of punishment, but because of recognition. This story was no longer about a wrist being grabbed. It was about the distance between two ways of seeing the world. One person sees power before seeing a human being. Another believes dignity must come before power. Evelyn stepped down from the witness stand. No applause, no noise. But everything had shifted. Callahan remained seated, his shoulders slightly lowered, not because a verdict had been delivered, but because Rachel's final question still echoed in his mind. What does a judge look like? He had no answer, and sometimes that silence speaks louder than any defense. In that moment, the entire courtroom understood that justice is not confined to a verdict. It lies in the willingness to examine the assumptions we once considered unquestionable. And that morning in Atlanta was no longer an incident. It had become a mirror, forcing everyone to ask, when we look at someone and think they do not belong, Are we seeing them, or are we seeing the limits within our own minds? After Evelyn Carter's testimony, the courtroom atmosphere shifted in a way difficult to describe. It was no longer a simple civil lawsuit, no longer a debate about procedure or professional instinct. It became a much larger question. When power is placed in someone's hands, who monitors how they see the world? The closing arguments began in a dense silence. The prosecutor rose, not loud, not theatrical. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case did not begin with hatred. It began with an assumption. An assumption that some people belong and others do not belong. An assumption reinforced over years, unchallenged, unexamined. She did not call Callahan a racist. She did not use inflammatory language. She simply laid out the facts. He did not request ID before using force. He did not verify information. He acted on a subjective impression, and that impression aligned with a pattern repeated many times before. This was not a 30-second mistake, she said. It was the result of years of never questioning how he evaluates others. The defense attorney stood next. He spoke of 18 years of service, of Callahan's family, of a nearly unblemished career. He protected this courthouse for almost 2 decades, he said. One wrong decision cannot erase the entirety of who he is. Those words were not wrong. A person is not only the worst moment of their life, but the issue here was not only the person, it was the consequence. Because when someone wearing a badge makes a wrong decision, its impact is far greater than that of an ordinary citizen. The jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom fell into quiet. Evelyn sat upright, her hands loosely folded before her. She did not look down. She did not look at Callahan. She looked straight ahead, not out of pride, but because she understood. Today's outcome would send a message far beyond her personally. Callahan sat several seats away. He no longer held the rigid posture from earlier. His hands were clasped together, his thumbs trembling slightly. Perhaps for the first time in many years, he was not in control. Not in control of the situation, not in control of the outcome, not in control of the narrative. 47 minutes later, the jury returned. Not too long, not too short. Long enough to think, long enough to understand. The presiding judge instructed them to stand for the verdict. On the charge of civil rights violation under color of law, guilty. No one exhaled sharply. No one cheered. On the charge of assault, guilty. Callahan closed his eyes for a moment. On the charge of obstruction of judicial proceedings, guilty. Those 3 words were not merely a verdict. It was a declaration that procedure cannot serve as a shield for prejudice. The judge announced the sentence. 14 months in federal prison, permanent prohibition from serving in law enforcement, 200 hours of community service with civil rights organizations. Callahan lowered his head, not because he hated Evelyn, not because he intended to harm her, but because he had never imagined the possibility that he could be wrong on this scale. Sometimes collapse does not come from malice, it comes from unchecked certainty. Evelyn did not appear triumphant. She did not smile. She did not look at him as handcuffs were placed around his wrists, because this was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment for reflection. After the trial, the federal courthouse announced a series of reforms, collectively referred to as the Carter Protocol. Quarterly implicit bias training, not annual. The creation of an independent oversight board outside the internal chain of command. Mandatory body cameras for all security personnel. An anonymous reporting mechanism for staff and the public. Not because a woman had been pulled away, but because the system needed repair before it caused something worse. 6 months later, Callahan worked night security at a suburban shopping center. No federal badge, no authority, just an ordinary job. He passed by people he might once have assessed within seconds. Perhaps now he looked at them a little longer. Evelyn continued to preside over hearings, but there was one small change. Each time she entered a courtroom, she remembered that morning. Not to nurture anger, but to remind herself, justice does not exist on its own. It depends on how human beings enforce it. In a later interview, Evelyn was asked, "Have you forgiven him?" She replied, "Forgiveness does not erase accountability, but accountability can create change." This story does not end with a verdict. It opens a conversation about the lens through which we view others, about how power can distort perception, about how a small assumption can lead to enormous consequences. And perhaps the most haunting part is not the image of someone being pulled from granite steps. It is the question that continues to echo. If Evelyn had not been the chief judge that day, would the story ever have been told? And if we only correct injustice when the harmed person holds power, how many others have walked away in silence? Justice does not begin with a verdict. It begins at the moment we pause and ask ourselves through what eyes we have been seeing others. The verdict had been delivered. The courtroom gradually emptied. Footsteps, chairs scraping, papers folding. All of it drifted away like the aftermath of a storm. But the questions raised by that morning did not settle so easily. Evelyn Carter left the courtroom last. She did not immediately respond to reporters, did not stand before microphones, did not deliver a lengthy statement. She said only one short sentence. "Justice isn't revenge. It's their responsibility." Then she walked away. The statement did not ignite a social media storm, but it echoed long enough in the minds of those who were truly listening. Within weeks of the trial, the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia began implementing its first reforms. Not because of public pressure, not because of image management, but because for the first time, the system had been forced to look at itself. The Carter Protocol was enacted, but what mattered was not the name, it was the spirit behind it. Implicit bias training was no longer a sign-in formality. Training sessions became real dialogues. An independent oversight board was established outside the internal chain of command. All discrimination complaints were required to undergo external investigation. Most importantly, body cameras became mandatory for all security personnel. Not because everyone is bad, but because power must be recorded. Transparency is not suspicion. It is protection for both sides. 6 months later, the numbers told a story worth reflecting on. Complaints increased by 38%. At first glance, that sounded negative, but in reality, it was the opposite. Discrimination had not increased. Trust in being heard had. People began to believe that if they spoke up, someone would honestly examine the claim. And that was progress. And Brian Callahan? 14 months in federal prison is not long by the scale of the federal criminal system, but it is long enough to think. During his first days in the correctional facility, he barely spoke to anyone. Not out of arrogance, but because, for the first time, he did not know who he was without a badge, without a radio, without the authority to tell someone to stop. Just a middle-aged man facing his own decisions. Someone asked him once, "Do you hate her?" He shook his head. "I don't hate her." "Then what do you hate?" He was silent. Perhaps he hated not realizing sooner. Hated that a moment lasting less than a minute could erase nearly 2 decades. But deeper than that, perhaps he hated confronting the possibility that he had been wrong not just once, that his professional instinct was not as neutral as he had believed. People rarely change because they are punished. They change when they are forced to see what they never wanted to see. Callahan began attending bias discussion groups in prison, not because it was required, but out of curiosity. A corrections officer later recounted that he sat silently through the first session. But by the third, he began asking questions. How do you know when you're judging someone based on experience and when it's based on bias? That is not a question of stubbornness. It is the question of someone beginning to recognize a gap in the way he sees the world. Evelyn continued her work. She still arrived early, still read case files in silence, still delivered sentences in a steady voice. But something had changed. Not in her title, but in the eyes of those who entered her courtroom. Many people looked at her a little longer, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. Recognition that authority can take many forms, and dignity does not depend on who is wearing the robe. A law student once wrote to her, "Chief Judge, your story made me realize that the most dangerous thing is not open hatred, but silent assumptions." Evelyn replied briefly, "An assumption left unexamined becomes a habit, and a habit can become a system." But this story is not only about Evelyn, not only about Callahan. It is about the tiny moments in everyday life. When we see someone walk into a space, a thought flickers in our mind. Do they belong here? That thought comes quickly, very quickly, so quickly that we mistake it for instinct. But instinct, too, is formed from the environment, from repeated images in the media, from experiences never challenged. The question is not, do we have bias? The question is, are we courageous enough to recognize it? At a later lecture at a law school, Evelyn was asked, if you could return to that morning, would you do anything differently? She paused for a few seconds, then said, I would still remain silent. Because sometimes silence at the right moment is not weakness, but the way to allow truth to speak for itself. The auditorium fell quiet. And perhaps that is what remains after everything. Not the collapse of a career, not the rise of a symbol, but the recognition that power gives us the ability to act. Character determines how we act. 6 months had passed since the verdict was delivered. The media had moved on. Cameras no longer waited outside the courthouse gates. The news cycle had shifted to newer events. But some stories do not disappear when the spotlight fades. They settle quietly, reshaping things far deeper than the headlines that once shook the public. Atlanta, 7:25 a.m. Evelyn Carter stepped out of her familiar gray sedan. The city was the same. The federal courthouse still stood firmly in the financial district. The granite steps were still cold in the early morning. But the atmosphere had changed. She walked toward the main entrance. This time, a security officer opened the door before her hand touched the handle. Not because they feared her, not because she was the chief judge, but because they had learned something. No one mentioned that morning. No one spoke of the red mark on her wrist or the briefcase falling onto the stone steps. But the memory was present in the way people looked at one another, in the way a question was asked before a decision was made, in the way eyes no longer scanned with suspicion but with conscious restraint. Evelyn still arrived early, still read case files in silence, still prepared for hearings as she had done for years. But each time she stepped into the courtroom, she knew her story had moved beyond the personal. She once said in a quiet interview without fanfare, I don't want to be remembered as the woman who was pulled away from a courthouse. I want to be remembered as the woman who helped make the courthouse better. It was not humility. It was a choice. Anger can attract attention, but change is what remains. After the trial, the Carter Protocol was implemented not only in Atlanta but also referenced in other districts. Implicit bias training was no longer a formality requiring a signature. Training sessions became honest conversations in which personnel were required to ask themselves difficult questions. An independent oversight board was established. Body cameras became mandatory. Every discrimination complaint had to be investigated outside the internal chain of command. The numbers 1 year later were telling. The rate of investigated complaints increased significantly. The rate of dismissals without review dropped sharply. Not because people suddenly became perfect, but because they began to understand that bias does not disappear when denied. It disappears only when identified and examined. Elsewhere in the city, Brian Callahan began rebuilding his life. He was no longer Deputy Callahan. No badge, no authority to tell others to stop. He worked night security at a suburban shopping center. A simple job, modest pay. No one recognized him unless they had read the old case files. There were long nights when he sat before surveillance monitors, watching people pass by. Families, teenagers, workers in a hurry. Perhaps sometimes he wondered how he had once viewed people like them. Perhaps the question was still there. What does a judge look like? Now that question was no longer a legal trap. It had become a mirror. People rarely change simply because they are punished. They change when they are forced to confront their own reflection in a new light. At a lecture at a law school, a student once asked Evelyn, "If you could return to that morning, would you do anything differently?" She paused for a few seconds. "I would still remain silent." The auditorium waited for her explanation. Because if I need a title to be respected, then the problem isn't me. And I wanted the truth to reveal itself. Her silence that day was not weakness. It was a test for the system, and perhaps for all of us. This story has no traditional hero, no simple villain. It does not end with applause or satisfaction. It leaves something else, a question. How many times in our lives have we looked at someone and thought they didn't belong? How many decisions have been made in seconds based on familiar images stored in our minds? We often think discrimination is loud and obvious, but most of it begins with tiny thoughts, a glance, a phrase like "doesn't look right," a vague feeling we call instinct. If no one pauses, those small thoughts become actions. Actions become habits, and habits become systems. Evelyn once said a sentence many remembered. Authority is given, character is revealed. Power may be granted, but character determines how it is used. That morning in Atlanta ended long ago, but its story continues. In the way a security officer asks a question before acting, in the way a law student re-examines their own bias, in the way a man who once believed he was right begins to wonder if he might have been wrong. And perhaps the next time you stand before a stranger, in an elevator, in an office, at the entrance of a building, you will give yourself a few extra seconds. Just a few seconds. Enough to re-examine your first thought. Because sometimes the line between justice and injustice does not lie within hundreds of pages of law. It lies in the moment we choose to see someone as a human being before seeing them through the lens of assumption. This story does not ask you to be outraged. It simply invites you to think. And if you are still here, perhaps you already have. Time has a strange way of softening what was once loud. Headlines that once filled the front page now sit deep in archives. Newer stories have replaced videos that once spread across social media. But some stories do not disappear with the news cycle. They quietly transform into lessons, if we are willing to listen. 1 year after that morning in Atlanta, no one stood outside the courthouse gates with cameras. There were no heated television debates. But inside that building, something had changed. Not the architecture, not the name on the plaque, but awareness. Newly hired security officers were told about the incident that year during their training. Not to shame a person, but to remind them that big mistakes often begin with tiny thoughts. Don't rely only on your feelings. Don't confuse experience with correctness. And never forget that the person in front of you is a human being. These sentences were repeated, not as slogans, but as a caution. In another part of the city, Evelyn Carter sat in her office, looking through the window at the familiar granite steps below. She did not think about the verdict every day. She did not live in the past. But on certain mornings, when the light struck at that same angle, she remembered the feeling of a hand tightening around her wrist, not to nurture injury, but to remind herself why the work mattered. She once shared in a closed session with young judges, "Justice is not only in the rulings we deliver, it is in how we treat the people who walk into our courtroom." The sentence was simple, but deep. Because power in a courtroom is not expressed only through a black robe, it is expressed through tone, through eye contact, and through whether we truly listen. Evelyn did not want to be seen as a symbol. She did not seek titles beyond the one she already held. But she understood something. Her story had opened a door for others. Young attorneys of color said they felt more visible. Law students wrote that they had begun questioning themselves more honestly. Some security officers from other states sent letters of gratitude because someone had finally compelled the system to look inward. Change does not arrive with an explosion. It arrives through small but steady shifts. And Brian Callahan? His life no longer resembled what it once was. No more strategic briefings, no more sense of authority standing at an entrance. But more importantly, he began looking inward. There were nights at the shopping center when the camera screens reflected his face in dim blue light, and he asked himself, how many times had I acted without re-examining my thoughts? Not every question brings an immediate answer, but the willingness to ask is already a beginning. An old friend once asked him, "Do you think the sentence was too harsh?" Callahan did not answer right away. Finally, he said, "I think the greatest cost wasn't 14 months. It was having to face myself." Sometimes the most significant loss is not a title. It is the certainty we once had about who we believed ourselves to be. This story could easily be told as a reversal of power, the person dismissed as insignificant turning out to be the most powerful in the room. But if we stop there, we miss the core of it. The issue was not that Evelyn was the chief judge. The issue is this: if she had not been the chief judge, would the story ever have come to light? How many others walked up those granite steps carrying invisible red marks on their wrists, without a title to shield them? True justice should not depend on the status of the person harmed. It must exist even when the injured hold no power. That is the real test of a system. In a quiet interview, Evelyn once said, "We cannot build justice if we are unwilling to examine our own biases." Bias does not always come from hatred. Often, it comes from familiarity, from repeated social images of what leadership looks like, what authority looks like. And when those images are not expanded, they become invisible boundaries. This story does not ask us to choose sides. It does not demand outrage. It simply asks for honesty with ourselves. The next time you look at someone and think they don't belong, ask yourself, where did that thought come from? When you hold decision-making power, whether at work, in your family, or in society, ask yourself, am I relying on facts or on assumptions? Because the line between justice and injustice sometimes does not lie in the law books. It lies in a tiny moment. The moment we choose to pause for a few extra seconds. A few seconds to ask. A few seconds to listen. A few seconds to re-examine our first thought. That morning in Atlanta is no longer breaking news, but it has become a lesson repeated in training sessions, in legal seminars, in quiet conversations. And perhaps what remains after everything is not the sentence, but the realization that power does not make us better. It simply reveals who we are. This story ends here, but its question does not. The next time you stand before a door, literally or metaphorically, and have the authority to decide who may pass, what will you rely on? If you have listened this far, perhaps you understand that this is not merely a story about one morning in Atlanta. It is a story about how we see one another. And sometimes, the most significant change does not begin in a courtroom. It begins with a thought we choose to examine. Some stories end with a verdict. Some close with a short line in the news. But some stories do not end. They do not disappear. They remain in the questions we carry with us. A year and a half after that morning in Atlanta, life had stabilized. The system functioned smoothly. Court dockets were still full. The granite steps still reflected the early sunlight. But if you stood long enough at the courthouse's main entrance, you would notice something subtle. The air felt different. Not because there were more cameras, not because regulations were stricter, but because there was more awareness. Young security officers in training were no longer taught only how to identify threats. They were asked to learn how to identify their own thoughts. What makes you feel someone is suspicious? Are you relying on facts or impressions? Have you examined your assumptions? These questions were not easy to answer, but they forced people to pause. And sometimes that pause is what prevents a mistake. Many asked, what truly changed after this story? The answer does not lie in the obvious, not in one man being sentenced, not in a protocol bearing a name, but in one tiny moment being brought into the light. The moment when one person looks at another and decides they do not belong. We all have moments like that. In an elevator, in a meeting room, in a classroom, during a job interview. A glance, a passing thought. And if we do not examine it, that thought becomes action. Evelyn once said at a seminar, "Justice is not only what happens when cameras are present. It is what happens when no one is watching." It was not a slogan. It was a reminder. Because a system can revise policies, but people enforce them. And if people do not change how they see, every procedure becomes only a shell. Another morning, another case. Evelyn sat on the bench. The defendant was a young man, a first-time offender. Defense counsel requested leniency due to family circumstances. The prosecutor emphasized precedent. Evelyn listened. She remembered the morning she had been stopped, not because she wished to compare, but because she understood the feeling of being judged before being heard. She spoke slowly. Justice is not the harshest punishment possible. It is the fairest consideration possible. The statement was not directly about the old story, but it reflected what had changed within her. She had not become softer. She had become more conscious. Conscious that power must be exercised with the highest degree of self-restraint. Elsewhere in the city, Brian Callahan still worked night shifts. No one called him deputy anymore. Just Brian. There were long nights when he sat before surveillance monitors watching people move through the mall. A group of teenagers is laughing loudly. A well-dressed man is walking quickly. A woman carrying a large handbag. In the past, he might have categorized them in a matter of seconds. Now, he paused. Longer. Not because he feared being wrong, but because he understood that absolute certainty can be an illusion. A younger colleague once asked him, "Do you think you were just unlucky?" After a long silence, he replied, "I think I was too certain." That certainty was the real danger. When we believe we cannot be wrong, we stop asking questions. And when we stop asking questions, we stop learning. From a distance, someone might say, Evelyn won. But this was not a contest. There were no medals, no absolute victories, only consequences, only change, and perhaps growth on both sides. Evelyn did not seek the collapse of a person, she sought the repair of a system. Callahan did not lose everything. He lost a position, but he gained the opportunity to reflect. Not everyone uses such an opportunity, but it existed. This story does not ask you to choose a side. It simply invites you to ask yourself, in your role, however small or large, have you ever decided too quickly? Have you ever looked at someone and thought they didn't look like what you expected? And do you have the courage to examine that thought? Evelyn once shared a short sentence. Power does not create bias, it reveals it. That means any of us, when given authority, carry a greater responsibility. Not the responsibility to be perfect, but the responsibility is to self-examine. If you return to those granite steps on an early morning, everything appears normal. But sometimes the most significant change cannot be seen. It exists in the way a person asks a question before acting, in the way a security officer says, I need to verify, instead of, not today. In the way someone chooses to slow down by a single beat. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson this story leaves behind. Not punishment, not glory, but the reminder that we do not control the first impression that appears in our minds, but we do control whether we trust it. The story in Atlanta ended on paper long ago. But in each of our lives, it can begin again at any time, at a doorway, in a meeting, at a glance. And the question remains, will you trust your first assumption or give yourself a few extra seconds to look again? If you have followed this far, perhaps you understand that this is not merely a story about one morning in Atlanta. It is a story about how we use power, however large or small, in everyday life. And sometimes, justice does not begin with a ruling. It begins with a quiet moment of self-examination within. Some trials end with the strike of a gavel. Some verdicts close with dry lines and archived records. But this story does not end there. It does not stop at 14 months. It does not stop at a protocol named Carter. And it certainly does not stop at the collapse of a career. It stops at a question. And that question is not for Evelyn, not for Callahan, but for each of us. An ordinary morning, a glance, an assumption left unexamined. That's all. No gunshots, no violent confrontation. Just a decision made in less than 30 seconds. And sometimes, what shifts an entire system is not a storm, but the moment someone dares to re-examine how they see another person. Evelyn did not prevail because she was the chief judge. She prevailed because she refused to use her authority to conceal the problem. She could have ended everything with a single sentence, I am the chief judge. But she did not. She chose to remain silent long enough for the truth to reveal itself. And that silence transformed the story from a personal misunderstanding into a mirror for an entire system. And Callahan? He was not a monster. He did not wake up intending to destroy someone's day. He was simply too sure that he was right. And sometimes, that certainty is the most dangerous thing of all. Because when we believe we cannot be wrong, we stop asking questions. When we stop asking questions, we stop learning. And when we stop learning, the power in our hands can become something we never intended. This story does not ask you to take sides. It simply asks you to pause. When was the last time you looked at someone and thought they didn't belong? When was the last time you made a decision based solely on a first impression? We often think discrimination is loud, obvious, and dramatic, but most of it begins quietly. A glance that lingers a second too long, an offhand remark, a door that is not opened. Justice does not live only in courtrooms. It lives in those moments. Evelyn once said something that made many people reflect. Authority is given, character is revealed. Power can be granted, but character is revealed in how power is used. And the truth is, all of us hold power in some measure. The power of a manager, the power of a teacher, the power of a parent, the power of a single glance. The question is not whether you have power. The question is how you use it. If that morning in Atlanta taught us anything, it is this. Justice does not exist on its own. It is built every day in how we treat others when no one is watching. And sometimes, the most significant change does not come from a verdict. It comes from the moment we ask ourselves, am I seeing this person through an old assumption? Just a few extra seconds. A few seconds to re-examine the first thought. A few seconds to ask one more question. A few seconds to open a door instead of closing it. Sometimes, that is enough to rewrite an entire story. If you have stayed until these final moments, perhaps something in this story resonated with you. Maybe a memory, maybe a situation you once experienced, or maybe simply a question that had never been asked before. Deep Life Tales not only tells stories of unexpected twists, but also of unexpected twists. We tell stories that invite us to look deeper, at power, at bias, and in ourselves. If this story made you think, share your thoughts below. Your experience might become light for someone else. If you believe change begins with awareness, walk with us. Like if you feel this story deserves to be shared. Share if you believe the truth should be seen. And subscribe so you don't miss the next story, where justice is not just a verdict, but a journey of self-reflection for each of us. Because sometimes, the strongest person in the room is not the one with the most authority, but the one who dares to question themselves.